Doomsdayers. I hope that's not what I come across as, because I'm not like one of those true doomsday people, that are like, you know, with that kind of spirit and worry and like warning. And, it is good to warn people about the truth. But um, there's a group of people out there, and I just want to say a few words on it. There's a group of people out there, and they're real. They're out there, Christians and non-Christians, certain denominations and certain people that are fighting for this world, hanging on to it, make America great again, non-Christians too, Hinduism and whatever, they're overly like zealous about peace in this world, but that's of another spirit. That's what God has given me. It seems odd to say this. I know it seems odd to say that being overzealous about peace in this world is like, sounds like something's wrong with me. What, you don't want peace? Someone might say. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I have a lot of the prophecies about concerning the last days, and there's quite a few. There's a lot of them in there. There's quite a bit. Isaiah, Joel, Ezekiel. There's a lot. And it's nothing but a destruction at the end. It just gets worse and worse. I don't see any other scriptures that say it gets better and better while man is ruling on earth. So some of these people are going around, they think they can convert this world, and maybe that's what these people in power, their intentions are all corrupt. They're gonna, I don't know, propose a new world order of peace by killing everyone, I guess. I don't know what their crazy plan is. You could read some of their stuff, Agenda 2030. I've read some of it. It's huge. The official United Nations website or something like this has Agenda 2030, and then there was Agenda 21. It's like all about the earth and cleaning up the earth and all these what seem like good things. They appear to be good, but their intentions are corrupt. It's not with good intentions. These are all things to just fool the people into thinking this is what it's going to be, but it's going to be the exact opposite of peace. It's going to be exactly the perfect opposite. Spiritually, when someone says peace, peace, there's destruction. We can understand that from Jeremiah. He says concerning false prophets that come in his name, they come in my name and say there's peace in this place. and then there was no peace. Then God sent destruction to those false prophets that said that. So when this world starts saying peace, peace, then the same thing is going to happen. Destruction. Because man just can't do anything right, good, from the heart. So I'm not a doomsdayer, but I believe the prophecies, though. And the day of the Lord is not like a day of peace. It's the day of everyone trembling and the earth shaking with fear and destruction before that peace comes. That's what's going to happen. Somehow, some way, that's going to be fulfilled sooner or later, and probably sooner. It's almost 2,000 years since his death. Almost 2,000 years since his death, and it's almost 6,000 years since creation. 6 days man works and toils, and on the seventh day it finally has peace, rest. 6 days of tribulation and war, and man trying to do good, working his own works instead of God working in him. These are the kingdoms of the world. They were always this way. Satan always has deceived the whole world. It's never been anything different. It was deceived 1,000 years ago. It was deceived 3,000 years ago. It was deceived 5,000 years ago. It was deceived at Noah's flood. It was deceived at Sodom and Gomorrah. It was deceived when the Hebrews, the Jews, didn't believe in Christ and they got taken out of the way. It's going to be deceived now and at this end, There's going to be a destruction before any peace comes. But there's some groups though that think they can build kingdoms, and specifically one of them is preterism, because they understand that the world is going to go on forever just as it is. So if it's going to go forever just like this with man ruling, Christ already came back, whatever, that's what they say, then it's up to them now to establish this peace. And it's really crazy because nothing divided can stand. Nothing divided can stand. And this world is as divided as it gets. There's all kinds of religions, there's all kinds of beliefs, there's all kinds of systems, religious or non-religious. There's way too much division for it to ever, for it to ever be fulfilled. Man bringing peace on earth. There's too much division. A house divided cannot stand. That's what I read. It cannot be set up. It has to be of one mind. And most of the world is not one mind. They're not the one mind of Christ. That's definitely not true. So how can there be, and that's why I stay away from all the, I just lost interest in it a long time ago, Facebook and stuff, because it's just, and I'm not saying some of these people aren't sincere with their opinions, but they're not seeking truth from God though. And there's just divisions and turmoil online. It's nobody's won. Nobody's truly won. They all got their groups, and there's thousands of divisions online. And I think Trump is doing some of this stuff on Twitter, and that's causing turmoil and division. It's what they want, because scattered people are easier to control, and they're going to propose something good eventually, someday, for this whole world, but it's going to end up being destruction instead. It's just going to end up being the opposite. And Paul mentions this. You can't escape it. There's going to be some crazy man. That's the temple. First, the shadow. The temple was defiled in Jerusalem, the physical temple. They came in and defiled it with physical blasphemy, and then the temple was destroyed, and then the kingdom was established. And so this temple now, ye are the temple. It'll be a man that's full of blasphemy inside by saying, I'm God, and he's going to be taken out with no power, it says in Daniel, or taken out with no one else. I don't know how it reads. No one else is going to take him out. Christ himself will come and take him out of the way. And then the full thing will be established. The kingdom was established, but then it's going to manifest. Like Revelation says, God Almighty has taken his reign, and the nations were angry. I would be angry too if I was a leader in this world. They're taking our power, our world that we've dominated since the beginning. The same spirit kind of has dominated this world. People in high places, heavenly places, spiritual, Paul talks about it. People in high places, in the heavenlies, powers. That's what heavenly represents, power. They do have power and authority. They were given that power and authority by God, just like Christ said to Pilate, you have no power unless it's given to you. He understood that God was the only true power. He's the perfect example of worshiping the one true God, and that's just, so many people can't understand it. He's the example of worshiping the one true God in the flesh, and he did it the natural way and fulfilled the law. He didn't break God's laws. But we no longer know him according to that specific thing, according to the flesh. That's, in a sense, the people who say Paul's letters are for today, in a sense, they're right. And that the other scriptures are not, I'm not saying they're not. But in this sense, they're for today, that everything is understood spiritually. In that sense, they're for today. But all of God's word is for today if you can read it through the Spirit and understand the types. These are everything that happened in Israel is always happening to people, God's people. But it's a very natural physical example of these things happening. Like the golden calf is just an easy, simple one to understand. They built a literal golden calf, and they probably think this represented some other god or something. But spiritually, people have golden calves now. It's not so much about the natural, physical golden calf. In their minds and hearts, they have golden calves. That's the understanding that you can learn from. Like Paul says, they're for our admonition. They're examples for us. It wasn't for them. It's for us. Anybody who reads that, it's been preserved for us to learn from it. So every word counts. Every word is true. If you understand the spiritual meaning of the law, what it means that the law is spiritual. It's not about physical fleshly things. I'm not defiled by wearing, a material of two types or whatever. It just isn't so. It cannot defile you. If someone wants to do that, then let them do that. But, there's people out there commanding to go back into the natural, and they're not understanding what it means to be clean. One, not mixed. Don't have your material mixed, your clothing. It's got to be one. It's got to be pure. It's got to be clean. It's what it means spiritually. The physical doesn't have any benefit here. Same with the food laws. They don't, I don't like eating junk food all the time. Every once in a while I cheat a little bit. I'm not going to lie. But overall, I want to eat, it's just something I want to do. But I'm not made righteous because, for example, eating a bite of pork, it's not going to defile you. People who are stuck in that, they're stuck in being carnal. They're not understanding, like Paul said, the law is spiritual. What part of the law? Well, all of it. It's all about the heart. That's why it's an easy yoke and light burden, because it's not a physical manifestation of do all these things. So many things they had to do physically, and it was a heavy burden. And they had serious cursings physically, more so than anything else, if they didn't keep these things. So if people break the law spiritually, they have a spiritual destruction and blinding, and they lose that connection with God. That faith starts slipping away. That's why I bring this up, that the law hasn't vanished, but we're not working. I'm not working trying to be good. I'm just denying myself. It's simple. Deny yourself and hear his voice. What does he tell you on everything? What does he tell you about this? What does he tell you about that? He'll tell you, he'll show you. You don't have to worry so much about it, He'll show you. And he won't dump it all on you at once. I've said that a few times. He won't. When somebody first believes, those words are true. Christ said, I have a lot of things to tell you yet, but you cannot bear them right now. He said to his disciples, I have a lot to tell you, but you're going to have to go through time and a process of being whipped and chastised. I'm not going to dump it all. I don't expect you to be perfectly separate from the world on day one. That's what I'm getting at. But people that are on this path, God is bringing them closer to him, and they're being more separated from the world. That's the process. That's the narrow way, a difficult way. And then he gives you more power and strength to do it. That's why we don't have to tell people and teach them so much. Do this, do that, because if someone does have Christ in them, then we trust that that same spirit is also teaching them. They're going to learn the same things. We're not going to be all divided and not have like-minded, mind of Christ. If somebody truly does have the Spirit of God, they're not going to be led into all kinds of sins, and then Christ leads someone else away from these things. One of these things aren't true. See, one of these ways are not true. That's why Paul said, "Are ye yet carnal?" to so much of the ecclesias, the churches, the gatherings, because they started to go back into the natural flesh. They started relying on works of the law and going back into sin, into flesh. And he's saying, are you yet carnal? What's going on here? That's why he says if so many times, if indeed you do have Christ in you, because many maybe had it and then they don't anymore, or they never had it. I believe both are true. That's why he says if, because it's not many. And God doesn't call many wise, many noble, many rich, he calls the nothings, the despised, more often. I'm not saying he doesn't call in other people, but it's just not as often. That's why Christ didn't say, go out and preach to the rich, to the gospel. Go to the poor, because that's God likes, because he likes to do it, because that's what he wants to do. He likes to take nothings in this world and make them something. But you're actually nothing to this world. When you become spiritual, they don't see any value in that or believe, but you actually are something to God because he's making you something. Spiritually, he gives you wisdom, knowledge, understanding, all these things. And you're not going to be liked for it. I'm not saying every person in the world, they see you and you're going to instantly, I'm not saying they're instantly going to hate, but overall though, the carnal man is at war with spiritual anything, spirit of God. So if you become spiritual, it's going to be a problem for carnal people. It's going to be a problem because they're seeing someone actually care about truth and actually want to walk in this narrow way. And they don't see people doing this. Not really. And when they see that, it's offensive. It's offensive because they know that this is the true way they should be walking, following the footsteps of Christ in this way too. And it's offensive to them naturally. It's not really their fault so much. Everyone's accountable for the works they've done, but you know what I'm saying? They're blinded. They don't know what they're doing truly. And that's why Christ says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And Stephen, when he got stoned for, probably should read it. He said a lot. There's a lot. He's quoting scriptures and telling them, the Jews there, the Hebrews, on how their ways were wrong, basically, to make it simple. And he's using scriptures. And they got angry and they hated it. And they stoned him right on the spot. And he said, don't charge it against them. Same thing Christ said, really. Same thing. Don't charge it against them. He had that same spirit. He didn't hate them. Forgive them. They know not what they do. Don't charge it against them. And that's becoming God in his image. Loving your enemies that's what we read. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. By what reward do you have by only loving those that love you? Don't other people do that too? Don't the enemies even do that with themselves? Yes, they do. So what reward will you have? Love those that also hate you. And then he says right after, that this is how you become like the Father, spiritually. Be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And Christianity can't understand this. Loving your enemies is actually becoming like God, so they charge it against God and say that he is not going to do this. He's teaching us something he himself is not. That he's going to torture people or resurrect them and just kill them, instead of doing the same thing with the first fruits. Through judgment, they're going to learn that evil is no good. They're going to figure it out eventually. They tasted it, they had enough of it, and they're going to come. The same way that the first fruits had, what does it say in James or Peter? I don't know. He says, in times past, we all did these things. We filled up in our flesh all these things. And I think he even mentions orgies. It's like some pretty serious stuff. Pretty big sins. In times past, you've done all these things. We've done all this. Get away from that now. There's no benefit. There's no life. And I seem to always go off track from the title of my videos. Not always, but a lot of times. Doomsdayers. The truth is somewhere in the middle. We're not like worried and doomsday, oh no, and have a spirit of like worries, doubts, and fear. That's a not being perfect. That's not being perfect. The good, better translations say it, don't worry about anything. And some of the other translations say it a little bit differently, especially King James Version. It says, but what that verse means is don't worry about anything. And that lines up with what Christ said, don't worry about tomorrow. If you have this evil kind of fear, your love isn't perfected, and you can see God through these truths, who he is. He doesn't want people to fear. By becoming this, you're becoming like God. How do they not see that? That God is light and there's no darkness in him. That he's perfect and that his intentions are perfect. But they can't say things like David and Abraham. They didn't truly see who God was in their heart. They didn't have him figured out perfectly like we can start understanding some of these things. They were a type of understanding, and they understood more than the rest of the unbelievers. But they didn't, King David, this is just what God has given me. He sought after God's own heart, but he didn't truly find it. Christ found it because he had the Spirit in full. David was a type, a natural, first the natural, then the spiritual. He killed enemies, and they did those things back then because it was eye for eye, tooth for tooth. There was no spiritual man to understand the law and do it spiritually. So this was the natural way. The wars with the enemy, natural swords. And what does Paul say? Put on the breastplate, put on your helmet of salvation. He's talking about war, but it's not a physical war anymore. All of it is spiritual. First, the natural, you can learn from all the natural examples and types and everything that was, is now, and is to come, but it's spiritual now. It's spiritual. And Paul was coming to an understanding of these things. You can see it in his writings. He even uses the word types. If you do a search, it should be in there, probably any translation. Types. He says these were types. These were something else, he says, and he uses them as types. I don't think that's mentioned too many times, that word, but it's in there. And if those were types, well, then all of it was types and shadows. And the types that we have is that it always waxes worse and worse. Like at the end of an age, like at the end of Noah's day, that was like a passing away of an age. It was a type of everything starting over again. But God's judgments weren't in the earth, his chastising spiritual judgments yet. And so it got worse and worse and worse. And Jerusalem was taken out, and that was a type. And we're in the middle of that happening again. It's just waxing worse and worse and worse. And then I believe we're coming up at this. There's not going to be another 2,000 years of starting over, and this time he's going to take over and reign, and the nations will be angry. And then his judgments will come in all the earth, like they are now to those that are on this path. But to the whole world, the kingdom's going to really start growing and being manifested in the world too, not just within. It's going to be manifested within, but in everyone, it's going to grow. So the people that say it's getting better and better, they're delusional. They don't actually believe or understand the prophecies and types. So I'm not a negative person, but it might come across that way sometimes. But I'm not like a true doomsdayer, negative. But there's no prophecy of it getting better and better until Christ reigns and actually takes over. In Hebrews, it says it. In Hebrews, there's one verse, and I don't think there's any verse like it that says it just like that. Christ is above all powers, authorities, nations, everyone. But then he says in Hebrews somewhere, and yet it does not appear to be so. Like it doesn't appear to be yet that he's over, but it's coming though. That reigning is going to come. He will dismantle all powers, authorities, everything in this world. It's talking about the world. It's going to happen here first. And the people that get away from this truth, they're going into some kind of other direction. They start denying that this is going to happen. Christ is not going to actually come. They're so spiritual in their own mind that there is no coming of Christ. This is wrong. God has shown me that. Preterism is one of them. Just stay away from preterism that says that Christ came already. They got something coming. They got something coming because they don't believe that there's going to be a worldwide tribulation ever again, because it already happened back in Jerusalem and everything was fulfilled fully, they say, full preterist. And I'm saying it did happen. This is where everything comes together. It did happen. Jacob's trouble happened on natural Jerusalem. It was the worst tribulation that God's people, natural Jerusalem, have ever experienced or ever will experience. Natural Jerusalem it was ended. There is no more natural Jerusalem. This is how this truth can be true, happened back then, and also happened during New Jerusalem, because it was never to be anymore. That was the worst it ever was or will be. And yet it's going to happen again, and it still could be true because that natural Jerusalem no longer exists. That was their worst. Any exile or anything you read about them being separated and divided, as bad as it was, 70 AD was the worst by far. It was the worst turmoil for them. It happened, and it's never going to happen like that again, because natural Jerusalem doesn't exist. It became New Jerusalem. That's what God has shown me. It's going to happen again, and it can happen again, and it doesn't contradict, because that passed away. But the whole world is going to experience something like that, a type, and it's going to be the worst in the full fulfillment, the worst tribulation that there ever was or ever will be ever again. And that's coming eventually. And that's where preterism doesn't rightly divide. They're types. It happened during the Old Covenant. See, as long as the temple stood, the Old Covenant still existed. And there was a mixing. There was confusion. There was, even the disciples in the beginning were a little bit thrown off. Should we circumcise Gentiles? And, read it in Acts. There was a dispute. Who knows how big or how long? And Paul was spiritual enough to come in and correct them. We're not putting this on Gentiles. They were never under the law. They're fulfilling it spiritually, And there was some kind of mixing for a time and confusion. I know people say that there's no such thing. The day that Christ died and was resurrected, the old covenant vanished. But unless someone can prove it, it still stood until the temple was crumbled. It still stood for the Jews, for the Hebrews. I believe they had to keep these according to how Christ kept it, the fleshly, natural way, They were still worried about not touching dead carcasses, I suppose. That's my final understanding on that. We understand not to touch dead things, as in unbelievers or spiritually dead. Don't touch them. Don't become one with them, Paul says. And he quotes from the scriptures. Don't touch unclean things. It's spiritual. It's not about touching a dead carcass or a dead bird and, you're defiled now. It's not. I think that's what some of the new wine and old wineskin might be referring to, and it probably refers to something else too, but you can't have both or else it bursts. So one has to go in order for the other to be fully manifested, and that's the new covenant. The old had to go. And Paul understood these spiritual things. We have a few examples, and the rest of the law is like this. The Sabbath means keeping the Sabbath means rest from your works. God is working in you now. You rest from your labors. It's no longer you working, to overcome sin. It's God working in you, his works. And Abraham was a type of that. He believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And James says, he did the works. He focuses on the work side of it, and it was credited to him as righteousness. It's not a contradiction. One example that to prove it is if Abraham said, I believe you, Lord, But then, I'm not going to sacrifice Isaac, which is a type of God, sacrificing and choosing Christ, a man, to be the sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. That was a type, Isaac. Everything is types. That was a type of what God was going to do to the only begotten Son, the first man that truly was spiritual in the whole world. First man to be resurrected and not die again. Firstborn from the dead. If he said, I believe in God, I believe you, Lord, but says I'm not doing this, it would not be credited to him as righteousness. It's that simple. He believed and did the works of God, whatever God told him. That's the point. Whatever God tells you, you do it. And they both are one. They can't be separated. Faith alone, as in no works save you. God doesn't pour out the Spirit on you because of some works. But when he does, by his mercy, no works, then you believe in him and you walk a certain way. If you're bought for a price, you walk a certain way. You believe and you do what he tells you to. They're one. And this is how you don't get any contradictions with everyone being judged by works, because it's going to be God's works versus your works. Your works will burn up. His works will stand. Our works are like filthy rags. That's the Sabbath day, resting. By denying yourself in your own mind that you're good and that you do good works, and, fully denying that, and you rest every day. That's why Paul talks about it. Some days are more important than others, and every day is equal. It's not a huge deal if someone says, hey, I want to make this day important. But it is a big deal if you command it and say, you have to do this. You got to keep it on Saturday or Sunday. And carnal people, especially those Hebrew Israelites, they call themselves, they really get off on this. They don't like this at all, because they're going back to the natural shadow understanding of Sabbath day and shadow understanding is, but they're not even consistent. They're not going to tell you, most of them, I hope most of them, not, to get physically circumcised. And yet they go back to the shadow on the Sabbath day. They're picking and choosing what's spiritual and what's not. Baptism, Sabbath, and circumcision. I call it the big three. We have the examples of how these are spiritual now. But the rest of the law is applied the same way. It's what they don't understand. Physical circumcision amounts to nothing physically. Physical water baptism amounts to nothing physically. Physical, literal Sabbath day, not carrying wood, amounts to nothing physically. And by understanding this and believing it, you're actually keeping all three of those things. That's how you keep it. That's why they were stoned for not keeping the Sabbath day back then, because of what it represented. They did their own works, literally, physically. And this was a big deal because of what it represented. Not physical labor, but resting from our work. No longer saying, I'm a prideful, self-righteous man and my works are good. No, you rest from that. Adam dies. Old man needs to die. I don't read anywhere where the old man is redeemable. He needs to die. That's the picture of the cross. Not that Christ was sin, but that's the picture of the old man dying and being put away. That's why Paul talks like this spiritually. You were buried with him. You're dead in baptism, and now you live. He's not talking literal. You didn't literally die and get drowned underwater. And then he even says there's one baptism. There's only one. So commanding to go back to the shadow is actually falling from grace, because you're acknowledging that two stand, and you're denying what Christ did for everyone by going back to the shadow. We don't physically kill people anymore, right? Love your enemies. What can't they? There was a real change. What can't they see? It's all spiritual now, including your enemies. It's a spiritual war. All that physical war is spiritual. All those physical laws are spiritual. Baptism, they got washed with water. The priest got washed with physical water. And this was important back then. the temple had to be perfect and not defiled. And if somebody went in there without permission or touched something, they would die instantly, it says. Why? Because the temple represents, you are the temple. You read that physical temple, and now you understand these physical things. You are the temple which God dwells in. So this is why you die, because of what it represented. You can't defile the temple, which means your own self. Otherwise, you're grieving the spirit, and worse than that, you die if you continue. The seed that sprouted dies. So it's pretty important. Sin is pretty important. But not many people can make a big deal about sin and also say, don't go back to the shadow thing. They don't have the right division there, rightly dividing. Sin is just as important as back then. It didn't change. His commandments are just as important. But we understand if you deny yourself, he works in you to fulfill his spiritual law, not to break it. But then I've been called, a work salvationist, doing works when they can't understand that it's God's works. And I think I need to end it. I'm ranting a little bit, but these things are true though, and they make plenty of sense once you understand it. That the whole law is spiritual, not just 3 parts of it, not just 5 parts. You can't pick and choose. All of it is.